going to quickly give you a little bit of my sort of intro to Harry Reese through typography. And this is just a little motif that when I saw this, I thought of him. And I think this is the kind of forecast of his future, right? And it's always been the forecast, it's always been the past. But I think typographically, it's just not right. So I was trying to figure out if this was more Harry Reese, or there's precision and elegance and space. And I know that that's still not quite right, Harry. I mean, you would tell me that typographically it works. But I asked Harry before, I gave him homework for tonight. And he did it, and he did it on time. And I'm just going to share with you, I asked him to write every job that he's ever had in his illustrious career. And we're just going to share that with you as text. But it took over 2 pages. And I think it starts with humble roots. But as a painter, painted address numbers on curves. That is a hidden here. And has led to who we know as our beloved professor here tonight. And so I just want to say one story that many of you may not know, that as you know, I'm sort of associated heavily with Isla Vista. But truthfully, I am not here. I would not have been moved here if it hadn't been for Harry Reese, who well before any of us even thought as adults and faculty to live in Isla Vista, he has been living. And I went over to his house, and I was magically surprised by the beauty and the possibility of living in this community. And it was because of Harry, who is a trendsetter, that I moved to Isla Vista and got deeply embroiled with the culture here. So I'm going to introduce another colleague who was basically, we were kids when we came here 25 years ago, going on 26, Kip Holbeck and I. And he was has always been a mentor and a parent, but now it's kind of inappropriate because I'm too old for that, but he has always been a solid guide and a force for me throughout these 25 years. And so I'd like to introduce Kip Holbeck and say a few words about Harry as well.
Thank you for being here for Harry's final lecture here at UCSB. What happened there? Okay. So what can I tell you about Harry Reese? I can start by talking about his artwork, how together with Sandra Little Reese, he created Turkey Press, which is nothing short of an empire within the world of artist book production. About all the artists and all the poets they've helped published, an absolute A-list of artists and poets, I should add. How their entire archive was acquired by the Getty Museum. How Stanford's now trying to get the stuff that the Getty didn't get. And about the many collectors with standing orders for anything that Turkey Press produces. Let's think about that. That much confidence in you as an artist that you say, whatever you produce, I'll buy. I've never experienced that. I can talk about his public art installations at minor places like Central Library in downtown LA, about his amazing paintings, one of which I'm proud to own, or the way he made UCSB the de facto institution for any young artist wishing to study book arts or papermaking. I can talk about the thousands and thousands of students Harry has touched, about his infinite knowledge, his infinite patience, and as we all know, his almost infinite ability to carry on a conversation forever. Harry has always maintained his passion for art making, and this contagious energy is evident in the fine quality of work we see year after year after year. Harry is truly a teacher's teacher, the one students speak about when they fondly recall their UCSB experience, and he's done this for 40 years. Let me make that clear. Harry has been making internationally renowned art and teaching at the highest level for twice as long as most of you have been alive. But this isn't anything that anyone that knows Harry doesn't know. So what can I tell you about Harry that you don't know? I know that if I cut right, he'll feed me a pass when we play pickup basketball against grad students. And that we'll always win because we had Ross on our team and Ross always cheated. I can tell about going to the movies in 1993, going to see Dragon, the Bruce Lee story. And as a joke, I brought a kimono and said, "Here, Harry, wear this." And Harry immediately putting it on and walking in the theater. I tell you about going down on a road trip with him to San Diego to see Bill Feeney's exhibition. And us making a pact saying, well, whatever, any music store we stop at, we have to stop and play all their guitars. And how long that journey took and how many guitars we played. But I think I'll tell a story off script, which because Kim reminded me of it. When Kim and I came in, our department didn't look like our department now. Our department was entirely male, almost entirely white. And we had one woman, Ciel Bergman. It was a problem. And there were 2 hires that year. One in sculpture, which Kim got, one in photo video, which I got. And the year after, there was a hire coming up in printmaking and book arts. Harry had been teaching here already at CCS for at least over a decade. It was really his position. Everyone knew that if they didn't hire 2 women in those 2 positions for sculpture and photography, computer, video, that Harry's position was gone. They hired Kim and they hired me. So essentially, I became the death knell for Harry's position because our gender ratio was still off. It's better now, by the way. So me being the person that Harry felt, wow, this hire took away my job, I need to tell you that of all the people I met when I came to UCSB, he's the only person that came up to me and said, if there's anything that you need to help you adjust here, this is my phone number, you call me with anything you need. And I think that's as big an insight to Harry's character as I can give you. So let me introduce this amazing man to you. A brilliant artist, a phenomenally devoted teacher, a sage of advice both in and outside the studio, and a man of integrity, honesty, and character, a role model for students and faculty alike, and my closest friend here for the past quarter century. Truly, the only thing I can tell you Harry has ever done wrong in my eyes is announce his decision to retire. So ladies and gentlemen, and people of all genders, let me please introduce to you Professor Harry Reese.
Very funny. No? Just try to put it over here. All right.
You picked the wrong person. This is too technical for me.
What did you do?
You lost the thing.
It did come off the thing. All right. Well, I got it. That goes in.
While we're waiting, I just want to point out that he did his jobs. I asked him to do it with his other hand, the hand that he hasn't trained. And so another moment,
Okay.
of perfection, Harry's precision of perfection in his handwriting. That was really penmanship. Okay, go ahead.
Visitors depart. Owls are mute. The sea is paved with broken moons. Finally, it is quiet. I thought I wanted this. The poem I just read is titled Self-Knowledge by Michael Hanna that appeared in the book Slender Means, a small volume that Sandra, I'll say more about later, and I published with our Turkey Press imprint in 1983. And we later reprinted it several times, which is one of the only times we've done that. And I'll get back to this poet and this long friendship I've had with him as we move along. I want to thank you all for being here. It's a happy occasion for many reasons. Like some of you, this is my last quarter at UCSB. Sorry this is coming in and out, but we'll deal with it. Or at least I think this is my last time here. I am retiring. And how many of you will be retiring in the next few weeks or graduating, going on to the next stage? Quite a few of you. Maybe not retiring. Let's hope. Well, the formality that I'm going through is called retirement, but it isn't quite like that. It is a pass to do the kind of work that I want to do. And I'm very fortunate to have been doing that work for a long time. So before I go on to a journey with this slideshow, and I'll be talking to you about the work that Sandra and I and so many of the people around us have done over the last 40 years. And that will be interrupted by various wisecracks and cliches and so on that I've bombarded my students with over the years, and they'll be familiar with these lines. And I will also be reading some poems, and not just because I like them personally, but because they make the mind dance. And I welcome you to think along with me and move your thought process along with me. Changes in art since I began teaching are too numerous to mention. But for now, a thin outline of my unorthodox past seems relevant to pass along as I consider some of, you can leave the light up, thanks. Some of the more memorable influences and genuine dumb luck that has accompanied me since I was an undergraduate some time ago. So let's cut to 1968. That's 50 years ago, when I was contemplating my graduation from UCSB. With my political science BA in hand, and UC Santa Barbara behind me, I wrongly supposed. That summer I marched off to Hastings College of the Law. A semester later I knew law school was a mistake. Stimulated by the provocative reading lists and moderate artistic success of my UCSB fraternity brothers, yes, you heard that right. My fraternity brothers, Don Wood, Judd Fine, Kelly Hames, and Larry Sultan. I quit law school and hitchhiked, which I'm not fully endorsing now. I hitchhiked into my future. 6 months and 300 hitched rides through the USA, Europe, and North Africa later, I returned to California intending to study poetry and art, but determined to file as a conscientious objector and continue volunteer draft counseling work that had led me to study law. Instead, I stopped in Santa Barbara and did not exit again until 1971, when after studying with Walter Capps, Robert Michelson, Mokusin Miyuki, Martha Banta, and Lawrence Wilson, I received another UCSB degree, this time an MA in Religious Studies, with an emphasis on religious themes in American literature. In one form or another, whether accepting, rejecting, embracing, or repelling, my generation was shaped and determined by the war in Vietnam. As one consequence of this period, some of us became way overeducated. During those formative years, as a graduate student, I studied cultural symbols, sacred texts, ritual patterns, imaginative literature, dream analysis, and numerous inquiries into the theory and nature of consciousness, both to advance toward a degree and, more importantly, for my own curiosity and personal enrichment. I built and lived in a shed-frame shack on a Del Playa cliff, overlooking the ocean. Received a high draft lottery number that dismissed my conscious objector case, but not my deeper sentiments. Wrote a few good poems and committed myself to make a life, even if I could not make a living as an artist. Although I'm certain that it was not true for all young people today, I made the assumption then that creative work of any form was a kind of progressive political statement. I felt comfortable making things, even though I did not know what I was going to do next or how to do it. But whatever I made or tried to make, it always seemed to me to have its origins in political awareness or had some kind of political edge. After my second phase at UCSB, I moved to Berkeley, worked as a waiter, sent poems to small magazines, some of which were actually published, saved money, and dedicated myself to poetry. By a miracle, which includes massive help from a known friend, I was accepted into the graduate creative writing program at Brown University. Between 1973 and 1975, I wrote and studied poetry, taught creative writing, learned the rudiments of typography and letterpress printing at Rhode Island School of Design, saw numerous fine press and rare books in the John Hay Library, received an MFA in creative writing, and teaming up with David D. Cooper, who's in the back, the known friend I just mentioned, I began to publish modest books of poetry. The pace of life quickened when I arrived at Brown and has not changed since. I learned how to commit to something I deeply enjoyed, which was the best learning experience I ever could have hoped for. My most profound professional decision came in 1974 when I established my own imprint, which I brashly called Turkey Press, to design, print, and publish limited edition books of poetry and art. Through coincidence and dumb luck came later when I met Sandra Little Paulson, who's in the back there, in San Francisco on my birthday in October 1975, a year after I'd started the press. We've been together ever since. We made a commitment to live and work together as friends, partners, and artistic collaborators. Turkey Press received its first grant, one of 4, from the National Endowment for the Arts. I sound like the chancellor here. In 1976. After receiving a second NEA grant in 1977, we searched all over California for a small community near a university where I might have a chance to teach, with inexpensive housing, open space for a garden, and room for a studio. To make a long story ironic, we found the house, and the community was Isla Vista. In September 1977, Sandra and I were married and bought the home where we continue to live and work today. The artist George Braque believed that Cubism brought painting within his capabilities. The commitment that Sandra and I have made to poetry, typography, printing, and making books by hand has brought the fullness of artistic experience within our reach. Even in our most difficult personal and professional moments, that commitment has never deserted us. The press has been the foundation of my creative work and professional maturity, and it has served as the vehicle for understanding the past, developing relationships, and comprehending technological change. More importantly, my experience with editing, printing, and publishing poetry provided the pathway for me to teach, even when I wound up in an art department. In the 1970s, there was no book art field that I knew about. There were no book art programs then at any college or university. And do I have to say, no internet, no cell phones, no hacker culture, no driverless automobiles. In the 1960s, Marshall McLuhan, my students have heard that name before? Okay. Marshall McLuhan proclaimed that the new technology turns the old technology into an art form. But few of us in the print and book art field now fully understood then how critically important technological change would be for the reception of the work we have made. From a very early age, I have always been a reader, and I deeply cherish that gift that has been with me my whole life. But what I suspected as a young student, and what has become increasingly clear to me over the years, is that the primary importance of poetry and all the arts is what it can add to the individual mind. The title epigram from my 1976 book of poems, Unknown Friends, introduces the story of my last 40 plus years. No matter how isolated you are or how lonely you feel, if you do your own things diligently and conscientiously, unknown friends will come to you and seek you out. When I first approached the College of Creative Studies in spring of 1978, my intention was to teach creative writing. I showed the books I had made as examples of the poetry I had edited, printed, and published, more as evidence of my intense involvement with contemporary poetry than with the books or the book as an aesthetic artifact. 3 days before the 1978 fall quarter began, I received a message asking me to call Professor Marvin Mudrick, co-founder of CCS, who had signed the form letter rejection slip that I was sent when I applied to teach 6 months earlier. When I called, he went straight to the point. "Do you want to teach that book class?" he asked. I said, "Sure." "What book class?" "Oh, I don't care what you call it," he said. "Call it anything you want, but just don't call it bookmaking. That sounds too much like Las Vegas." I paged through every book I owned, went to the library, gathered my courage, and the next day I planned the first class I ever taught in an art program. I called it The Art of the Book. And I've never called a class bookmaking over the years. When I began teaching art, I had formerly taken only 2 studio art classes and 1 art history survey. The experience of learning to make art while teaching it to students over the past 44 decades continues to humble and inspire me. From my earliest days, I was always more concerned with learning and very little, if at all, with teaching. Like so many people I have known, young and old, I was an excellent student at times, but only when I was deeply committed or motivated. So I thought then, why not continue that approach as a teacher? Besides, I wasn't faking it. I was only showing the students what I knew how to do, what I was interested in, and asking for their best work. But whether one knows it or not, one never walks alone along the path of creativity. I moved step by step into teaching, not knowing what would come next, and I learned along with the students. Many of them are here today, too, which I'm very happy about. But what I learned the most was to trust my own sensibility, my intuition, and how to apply what I had discovered through long hours in the studio, working alongside Sandra, our dog, and cats, listening to Vin Scully call baseball games and late-night radio. And just as I made commitments to my own aesthetic choices in the studio, I learned how to believe in my own critical judgment and how to tell that to another person. Through the discipline of team sports when I was younger, I learned how to perform under pressure and how to trust the mechanics and limits of my own body. In the beginning, as an inexperienced teacher, I had to learn how to trust what I saw, what I knew, and what I felt about, how I felt about it all. Although I never had much trouble talking about anything, an affliction reinforced by the garrulous undergraduates I knew at UCSB, I learned to follow what I wanted to do. And I think that because I was so committed to it, I was able to find support for it over the years. I wound up teaching subjects I wanted to investigate or simply study more intensely, such as visual poetics, experimental printmaking, elemental digital media, and the influence of print on culture. By 1996, again another kind of miracle, one might conclude, I was chair of the Department of Art, teaching classes, book art, papermaking, visual literacy, and media ecology that did not exist when I was a student. In the same building I had to sneak into to make raku pots when I was a political science major 30 years earlier. My own personal experience helps explain why I tell students, especially when they are in the presence of their parents, to follow their interests, not their abilities. Whether you call it your passion, your bliss, your focus,
or terrible purpose. In the long run, you will probably learn how to do whatever you want to do. But I doubt you will ever be happy without the deep commitment to your work. As we have seen with so much popular media, the failure to connect creative output to a deeper mythology often leads, at best, to melodrama. Poetry and art are hopelessly undervalued or ignored in contemporary American life. But our best students, who in their own way make the same commitments that we have done, give us more hope for the future of our field than we could ever imagine. Every teacher knows that our students make everything we all do together relevant, worthwhile, and meaningful. Art is the attention we pay to the wholeness of the world. As students, we have all had to pay close attention not just to what we have made or intended to produce, but also to how that artifact fits into the world. Art subverts existing order by insisting always on making things in the face of society's demand that things match pre-existing categories and models. In our society, artists are especially aware of the challenge and dangers of new environments presented to human sensibility. The operative force in such environmental change is always new technology producing new perception. Whether we think of a beginning student, a graduating senior, or a retiring art professor with an eclectic past, all artists bridge the gap between technology and perception. In my life and work, I've been extremely fortunate to meet so many supportive people. Friendships have been continuous and deep over the 40 years I have taught, and I'm fortunate to have found a way to work that has involved more or less mature people of all ages. As I suspected long ago, but had no way to authenticate, my life has been the primary work of art. And everything that I experienced contributed to it. When I say to you, trust your feelings, I also want you to remember, as the science fiction novelist H.G. Wells wrote over 100 years ago, human history is more and more a race between education and catastrophe. What you know matters, and what you do with that knowledge matters even more. About 20 years ago, an old friend who was visiting said to me, in a way he intended as flattering, that my work looked like a group show. There's a story behind every work of art, and certainly will not be able to go into much detail today. You probably don't want me to go into the minute details of what unifies seemingly disparate intentions, motives, and results. As we've learned to say, and I'll spare you those details, and let my biographer worry about it. For now, I have some images to show and some more poems to read. Okay, we can turn that down. And you can do that. I probably turn this on here. If I can get this going. I'm going to have to operate this manually, so I might be a step slow. There's a pun in this title here, because when professors retire, they're often recalled. If you get the joke here, I think it's kind of fun. I'm going to read you a short piece out of one of our books. History's lesson, if it really teaches, must be that while nothing can be done about the future, we can always change the past. It is not true, that transparent notion, that everything that was ever said sounds somewhere still. No, the whole world, almost, is beyond recall. This is from this book called The Quest for Mount Misery and Other Studies by Keith Waldrop, who was one of my teachers. When I talked about my background as a student, I came into an environment in the 60s that was volatile. So a lot of people didn't know that. They were having a pretty good time. But I knew about that because I was paying attention to some of the things that were going on at UC Berkeley. The free speech movement started about the time I ended high school and came here. I went to a junior college for 1 year and then came to UCSB in 1965. So the free speech movement was already in swing at Berkeley. It wasn't until about a decade later that I got to meet Mario Savio, who's one of the leading people in this group, and you can still hear some of his talks, because he was the best man at my sister's wedding. And I wanted to tell him how important he had been as a figure in my life, even though I didn't know him at the time and so many other people did not. But he was doing courageous activities, and it showed to me that I could have some courage to do a little bit more than what I had been doing up to that time when I became an undergraduate, which was primarily playing sports and thinking about myself. There was a class going on at UCSB as I was finishing, co-taught by Professor Gary Brown. And is Gary here today? I thought he was coming today. But I wanted to make sure I had an image of Gary in here. And co-taught with Peter Wiggum, who later we did a book project with. And that class was very influential for me because it was called The Poet, the Artist, and the Book. And it got me thinking, this is such a thing actually happen. And that festered in my mind for some time while I was doing a lot of other traveling and studies and so on. And finally, it struck me at a later time that I might be able to pursue that. I want to thank Gary for introducing me to papermaking, and all of our students in the papermaking area certainly feel the same way. We're able to use that lab in a good way. As an undergraduate, here's a photo. I thought Kelly might like this one because he had one like that of him the previous year or something. But there I am as a vigorous guy trying to make sense of myself and the world with a kind of nice haircut on the right. But I like to say I was a reader. I had always loved books, but I didn't know what I was going to do with them. I thought I was going to go to law school, so that was what I was all about. But I was also a war resistor, a draft counselor as an undergraduate. And that was an important part of my life, and that's why I wanted to go to law school. But as I said, it didn't last. While I was attending Hastings College of the Law, I went around down the street to the San Francisco Museum of Art and saw this installation by Ed Kienholz, the Portable War Memorial. And this was a pretty ambitious time with a lot of people upset, my age, and all over the world about what this country was doing. And so this exhibit of Kienholz was very formative. I sat down and had a Coke. Right there, there's a place where you could have a Coke, which I never drank, and contemplated all these wars going on and decided I was going to quit law school. So I did, and I traveled to Europe. And I recall Gaudi's Sagrada Familia Cathedral in Barcelona. What a wonderful spot. But more impressive was the Parc Güell. And I spent days in this park looking around. And this particular area here, the stairway going up and this wall supporting a roller skating rink, I looked at these tiles from a distance. They all looked kind of like this grid pattern. And I got up close, and I saw that Gaudi had taken these very regular tiles from around the town and broken them and then put them back together, but not quite the same way. And I realized later on, many years later, that this is what I'd been doing my whole career as an artist. I'd been identifying something, studying it closely, taking it apart, putting it back together, but not quite the same way that it was. I thought these were beautiful pieces then and now, and they'll be part of something I'll do in my retirement. One of my teachers at UCSB, Lawrence L. Wilson, as some of you would remember him, was a complex person, but he was a very good teacher for me. I told him I wanted to go to study creative writing. He said, well, all writing is creative. Study writing, and you'll learn about anything that's creative about it. In Isla Vista at the time, when I was a grad student, there was the Unicorn Bookshop, a very important place for many people, one of the only spots between Los Angeles and San Francisco where you might be able to find a poetry book in a bookstore. And it had this very modest beginnings in '67 and lasted about 5 years. Many impressive people came down here, and those who were writing the cusp of the counterculture at the time. Gary Snyder's major piece of writing about the environmental movement, a manifesto, was published by the Unicorn Bookshop. Noel Young printed it in Santa Barbara. Coming out of this bookstore, Ken Maytag, who owned it, supported a publishing business that it was very influential to many people around the country, and especially to me as a young person. I had dreams of getting a printing press when I was here as a student, living out on the beach. And I was looking at novels, writings that were slightly unorthodox, but always had a strong edge to them. Kenneth Patchen was a conscious objector during World War II. And his novel, this is a novel here, if you can believe it, with pages like this in a novel. And I thought, what's going on? This is not the way I've been taught novels look. And so I was drawn immediately to this kind of work and said, I want to do that, or at least, if I can't do that, I want to help someone else do it. These were covers that Patchen did. And the work of Jack Spicer that I saw in San Francisco really interested me because I saw so many books that were being made, not just collections that were in magazines or groups of poems stuck together as I was hoping to publish myself. But I saw these books, strange little beautiful books, and produced many of them by Graham McIntosh, whose work I began to study. And later became very close friends with Graham. Sandra and I were proud to have Graham as a close friend. I studied the work of the Lou John Press, two very strange and wonderful people who wound up in New Orleans and Tucson and made these exotic, colorful books, the kind of books that you usually make your first time out of making something, very wild and garish. And then I studied the work of Jonathan Williams with his Jargon Society. This was very impressive work for me. And I say this to students all the time. Go out and find something you like and study it. And we later, Sandra and I, became very close friends with Jonathan Williams. And then during this time, I was babysitting for a friend through my friend Brian Barnwell. He introduced me to a woman named Sue Schmidt. And so Sue asked me if I would babysit for her kids because she was going to Los Angeles to try to negotiate the rights for a movie that she had written. I said, okay. And she was working with a person who had came out from England to help produce this movie, and she wrote some rules for writing that she put up on the kitchen wall. So while I was babysitting, I wrote these down. And these rules are pretty extraordinary. If anyone wants a copy, I'll be happy to give them to you. But among these rules were things that said something like, always understand that the person you're writing for is in fact yourself. The reader is your equal, just as smart, just as quick, just as perceptive. You can never fake out, con, or fool a reader. Remember that he wants to believe what you are saying and he wants to discover himself in you. Never bullshit him. And another one, don't be intimidated by the enormity of what you undertake. Trust your instincts, trust your voice. Writing is a process of discovery. At the outset, you will know nothing. At the end of it, you will know everything. But the only way to get from one to the other is to dive straight into your ignorance. Humbling process. Don't concern yourself with form. The material you deal with will assert its own form. Let it take you where it wants to go. These rules were written by a woman known as Sue Grafton, and long before she began her series or alphabet series of writings. And later I got her to come to the College of Creative Studies and to read, and I gave her a copy of this, and she said, oh, what's this? And I said, well, it was on that wall back there in 1971 or so, and I typed it down. She said, are you kidding? I said, no, you wrote this thing. She said, well, I'll be. Now, can you identify this person here? I've given you the outline, so now I'm just giving you some of the details. I always like to show this photo because I like to see myself with a little bit of a smirk. I'm standing there as if I really know how to print. I actually didn't know how to print. I knew how to set type. And David Cooper and I taught ourselves to print. And we smashed type the first time we did it. And this was a very humbling process. You think of what Sue was writing about writing. It was certainly true about printing, and it's certainly true, I've later found out, about making art. But there I am at this press, which I vindicated was really the important formative moment. Here's a photo with David, David, can you take a short bow in the back? I hope I don't embarrass you too much, but I'm glad he's here. I've given these talks many times, and I can't think of maybe one or two times only when David's been in the audience, but I want to make sure I let everybody know how important and informative it was to be working with someone with David's character and knowledge. He's a great mechanic, and he really wanted to learn how to do this. He was a PhD student in American civilization at Brown at the time and interrupted his studies to help me jumpstart Turkey Press. And not just helping, but we partnered and teamed together. An important person in my life at the time was Edwin Honig, a poet and translator. I helped him with his press, Copper Beech Press, as an assistant because he said, well, you like books, don't you? And he was more of a poet, so I helped him launch his press. And Edwin figured very largely in the rest of my life at Brown University. Keith and Rosemary Waldrop, they're here in their basement, and a photo was taken a little bit after I left Rhode Island. That's actually our press, David, there that we carried into their basement. But their Burning Deck publications were extremely helpful. David and I would get on the phone to Rosemary and say, Rosemary, what's going on? We were hearing these sounds in the press. And she'd laugh and say, oh, yeah, you're just learning how to print on cover stock. And things like that were assuring to us, but we were very pleased to have people, teachers in our lives, who treated us like real people, brought us into their homes, served us tea, and showed us what they were doing with their lives. Michael Harper was another important person. He said, I'm giving you this job to do because you're busy. I know you'll get it done. You're a busy guy. I know you'll do it. And I said, why are you doing this? I've got all this. He said, you'll get it done, won't you? And I said, well, yeah, but that's not the point. A great person in my life. The output of Turkey Press from the first year was very modest, but David and I pretty much split the work on these books. And it was a great experience to have this kind of work behind us. But the press, as I said, was the foundation of learning because we learned so much by doing the work. I never really made art in my thinking. I was just simply doing something, well, sort of mechanical. But in this work in particular, as I was inking up the press, I noticed these strange designs coming onto the linoleum block, and I said, geez, if I print that, it's probably going to make this different mark. And all of a sudden, I had one of these moments that we all wish we'd have many more of, where something original in my life was occurring. And I had these manuscripts because I really wanted to get them out in the world. I believed in what they were. Or how they had come into my hands, and I thought I was probably the only one who was going to publish them. So the author, Philip Daughtry, who went by the name Suntree at the time, had these poems, this one, At Wounded Knee. I wanted to fall, like a deer at full run. When they took my ankles and trailed me away, I remember leaves sticking to my tongue. Philip was this English guy, came to America, but he stopped off and lived with Oglala people in the middle part of the country, and came away with a kind of language for his writing that I was suspicious of at first, but began to trust. And it reminded me a lot of some of my ancestry, of Cherokee and Native American. The book Unknown Friends, I mentioned the epigram earlier. I again want to mention David Cooper, who hand-set and printed this book. of my poems, my only book of poems. I probably would never have done that. When I finally got around to it with him, asking him why he did it, he said, because you would never have done it. And he was absolutely right, but I want to thank him once again for doing that. And this one, no matter how isolated you are or how lonely you feel, if you do your own things diligently and conscientiously, unknown friends will come to you and seek you out. So, thanks. As I said, I met Sandra, and we decided to leave Berkeley to go find our fortune somewhere else, and we found this little house in Isla Vista that looked like no one lived there, but it had a place in front for a garden and a building in back that looked like it was just about ready to fall down. And we thought, well, that's where we're going to put the press. And we have to have a garden, we have to have the press. So we moved in. And that was a building, a couple years later, we actually spiffed it up. And as soon as I came here, I started doing some of the things I had done in Rhode Island, where I'd worked for the Rhode Island State Council on the Arts. I started working in the Poetry in the Schools program and received a grant from the California Arts Council to be an artist in residence in Isla Vista, and that was in 1978. Well, it turns out that was the year that Proposition 13 came in, and it eliminated all those grants. So I applied the next year, and I got the grant again. So my goal as the first artist in residence in Isla Vista was to conduct poetry readings, and right about the same time I began teaching in the College of Creative Studies. So one of the things I did at that reading series was to print broadsides, or these single sheet poems, for all the poets who participated. Sandra, at the meantime, jumped right into working with the press, became a great setter of type, a printer, binder, editor, as she continues to be today. And we began to make paper, and this is part of the thanks to Gary Brown. As I was teaching in CCS, I had a student come to me and said he wanted to make a book out of his handmade paper. I said, that's a good thing. Where'd you get the paper? He said, I made it. I said, you? And I looked at the guy. You made this paper? And he said, yeah, I did it over in the art department. So he took me over and he showed me, and I remember I had met Gary a long time ago, so I reintroduced myself, showed him the books. He was a little skeptical, but he invited me to come in and take a closer look. So I decided I would make paper. So my friend David Roberts, who showed up, colorful person here, he said, I'm going to make some paper with you too. So we were taking these drills and these long bits onto 3/4-inch drills with a plaster connector down on the bottom for beating up plaster, and we would beat up scrap pages of books and so on and throw them out onto cardboard and stand back and watch it dry. And that was our first paper, and we were just so amazed. And so we began to study what paper making was all about. And John Babcock, who's still going as a known artist and paper maker, was one of the few people that helped us out. He was a friend of David's, and he helped us a great deal. And some of the early paper I made was with blenders and scrap paper and bamboo, and it just came close to ruining all the type. That's some of my early calligraphy, by the way. And then I began making these pulp paintings, and that's the kind of thing that all of a sudden started taking off. People would buy these things from me. They wouldn't buy a book of poetry, but they'd buy one of these things I did with paper and color. And I thought, geez, doesn't make sense. Because it'd take 4 or 5 months to make a book. And it would take me an afternoon to make one of these, and it didn't make sense. So this was the cover for the David Roberts book with some handmade paper. And here's Sandra and I in our front yard with our dog Vince. There's a bale of cotton linters on the porch up there. Just getting into it, we're having a great time. And here we talk about collaboration all the time. Another poem of Michael Hannon. The collaborator on this one was Vince, our dog. Sandra inked up his paw with Sumi ink and put it right there to splash that. So we had him. We also had artists starting to come seek us out. One was Bern Porter. And Bern Porter is one of these very excitable people that I hope that some of you might look into more. He came to see us when he was about the same age I am now, and had a great time with him, learning about his past, working with the Manhattan Project, having galleries in Sausalito, being a publisher, publishing Henry Miller and A Nice Nin and so on. And we had him work with us, but Burns' language that he used to us in looking at what we did, he says, you're on a good track here, don't repeat yourself. Use odd numbers. Don't do things so regularly. And so he was a little bit of a liberating influence. I didn't have art teachers like this, but I had someone in my life like Bern Porter who could write poems like this, such as Time, which is later, 3:45, 3:30. Poems like that just drive you nuts. And he also started sending me these book proposals, and he numbered them, and it was strange, big packets of information. So to make myself a serious paper maker, and to allow the paper makers to talk to me, I bought a Hollander beater. And there I am, that's actually me on the left. I'm not wearing a wig. And this Hollander beater, which I still have on campus here, we call it Harry's beater. And one of the things that we did, Sandra had this business that we called a pet. We made coffee filters that were reusable out of cotton muslin. And we started this when we lived in Berkeley. And as we would make the patterns, there'd be some leftover muslin. And she said, well, we better get rid of this. I said, no, hang on to it. One of these days we might make paper. She said, what? Paper? Are you kidding? I said, I don't know, things happen. So anyway, we had a lot of this first-rate muslin, which later became part of what we did with paper making. There's Sandra cutting some up, getting it ready to turn it into paper. The first days of making paper, as Mary Hebner knows, and Carol Lee Campbell, who attended these workshops, I called it the California Chinese method because I made the paper outdoors and dried it outdoors. Students in my class look carefully at this, how I weigh down the paper outside. But it's how I made paper for a lot of projects, including some I'll show you later on. I just thought this stuff was really beautiful to do. And here we have a birth announcement for a close friend's new one into the world, but on the handmade paper. And I reflected back to when I was a waiter in Berkeley in 1973, and Alan Watts had come into the restaurant where I had worked and left this calligraphic scribble onto a paper napkin. And so with help from David Cooper and some scholars at Brown University, I pieced together some translation and made this translation of mine that says, you discover who you are by acting naturally. And this kind of thinking and translation, I wanted to mimic in a way or follow some of the thinking of Alan Watts. And there's some long stories related to this that I won't tell, but this particular piece here on this side has gone viral. And if you look up, you discover who you are by acting naturally, you're going to see a lot of this on Pinterest and on Facebook and on Just Quotes and all these other sources. And so the paper became a very important part of our life. Our life was full because we stayed up all night, usually, listening to late night radio, listening to Roy of Hollywood, Roy Tuckman's program. He just started his program. Bruce Bile, a friend who was here tonight, had told me about Roy, and I wound up meeting him and presented him one of those little Alan Watts pieces because he still plays Alan Watts programs today. He does it on Sunday mornings and also late Thursday night, Friday morning on KPFK in Los Angeles. Through his program, I got to meet a lot of people over the years, including Terrence McKenna. I made this postcard for him in 1989 and sent it to him with a little title in there, Having Archaic and Eating It Too. And later, Terrence used it as a title for some of his talks that he gave. And so we were going to do a book project with him and weren't able to do that, one of our many projects. Another character that Matt Cohen knows about, Bob Dobbs, who is a McLuhan scholar and Joyce scholar, very eccentric person, but I've got to learn about him through late night radio, listening to KPFK. And I would be teaching a little bit at the campus and coming home and is working all day, which was the style that we were used to doing. This book, West Nevada Waltz, was a book where we used handmade paper, where we went to Nevada and dug pigment out of the ground and used Levi's and American flags for these colors, making pulp paintings or paper paintings. For this was 1981. I didn't know much about what was going on. I thought I was inventing this process. And this is something I want to show you. I talked to the people in my class about this, and they say, can I make a big sheet of paper? I say, sure. But what are you going to do with it? And this is the story. I made this huge frame, almost like I'm framing a wall, and put this plastic screen on it, and then started throwing pulp like I was channeling Jackson Pollock with paper pulp, trying to build up these colors and so on. I was having a great time, and so this took a long, long time to dry, and I have to cover it every night because I dried it outside. And then Bruce and I, here we go, Bruce, because Bruce was my assistant that year. We took this off, and there's the frame in the back, and we were feeling great. That's the back of it. It's looking kind of insipid. And then we said, well, what are we going to do with it? So we put it on our bed, and there's Sandra looking at me, caught in this look that she gives me every so often. The look says, okay, that thing's on our bed. Where are we going to sleep tonight? So that night we slept on the floor, but that was the only night, and because I had to get rid of that or do something with it. So I learned how to make frames then and how to frame art, and I had to, or I would have had to go out with it. We've had many occasions over the years to get involved with various poets and writers, but I mentioned Michael Hannon as a very important person in our life, and I'd like to read this poem if I can do that here. The poem is called The Sea Gazer, and we wound up doing another version of this book. We met Michael in 1978, and I came home to Sandra and I said, I don't think I can sit down here, take a look at this poem, because I got it from him. And I said, I've got to publish this person, and I don't care what else is in this book, but I got to do it. What do you think? She felt the same way. It's called The Sea Gazer. To behold unbearable flowers has been my recurrent fantasy and wish. Meanwhile, I await an invitation to love. Called down to witness God in his loveless immortality, I am drinking the moon. Let innocents hold to their ignorance. The sea reveals nothing to a novice heart. I was not always like this. Remember now my several years of faith. Some element of truth removes me. Undone, I prepare my heart for the shock of paradise. Be jealous of sorrows. We are hurt and crying in the wood. The night is brief, and permanence belongs to God. This generation, singular for a lack of heroes, we do not mourn what we have had, but what we cannot have again. So a man walking all night will take from his pocket a picture and weep, and be found drunk in the streets, his situation compounded by arrest, and he will keep that picture, nor give up weeping. All things connect in our elements. There is in these lines something I must forget. We have all been children, and in fact, lost. The women came later, and for all of them I've never forgotten one, and she is old and wiser than poetry, who also knows that there is in the world a difficult wind, the best and only wind for men. So we live for the promise that the mind may revolt to some stronger condition. But mostly we are weak with horror at the soul that wants to swim up through babies and marriage, through murder and religion. Yet wisdom might come from that. These are desperate contentions. To walk with oneself is to know a pained endurance. To ride in a chariot gilded with friends is to be admired. All things connect in our elements. I am a sea gazer plain enough, watching the white boats ply nets among the trembling fish. Beset by the strands of my own life, I am often in need of salvation. Nothing is what it seems. I have watched my beauties change, and to me nothing is safe. After an hour, the room is changed, not so much by light as by the entrance and dismissal of thought. What were we thinking of? that the universe is well made, that God is not absurd. So you see what I mean. It is too early for me to take up the history of the region and consolidate my intimations. I've seen my beauties change, and I've forgotten paradise. Did I say at the beginning my wish? The wind is in my face. I go blinded by the flowers. This poem was written by Michael Hannon in 1964 when he was 25 years old. And the version was published in the City Lights Journal in San Francisco in 1966, and we made our first revision of that in 1978. It's a very different poem in some ways. And then in 2003, I did a limited edition. I'll run through that later, and I published a book about it we published it as another book of ours, an illustrated edition in 2007. Through Michael Hannon, we've met many other artists, poets, writers. This book, Venerations and Fables, came right out shortly after The Sea Gazer. And through this book, Michael became friends with the artist William T. Wiley. He gave a copy to Wiley, and Wiley said, I must meet this person. And at the beginning of the epigram for Venerations and Fables is, if there's veneration, even a dog's tooth emits light. Wiley had a show at the Museum of Modern Art in San Francisco a few years later and had made sculptures based on Michael's poems. And when he sold the sculptures, he gave Michael half the money, and Michael was able to buy a house. Do you think we like these people? Wiley is a terrific person and was so generous with our friend and helped him turn around. We did a book, Fables, based on that work. Later on, my favorite poem, which I have, some of you see it in my house, it's called What the Cicada Said. I am Pharaoh, come from the land of the dead. This is my last incarnation. One long afternoon outside the window of a fool. And our little book, Slender Means, that I quoted from earlier on, with the self-knowledge. Another one here called The Good Marriage, which came in a letter that Michael sent me, and he didn't have a copy of it, and I called him and I said, I'd like to print that poem, and he said, what poem? And so I rescued it from oblivion, and I'm really happy about that. Other work we've done of his, this one, it's an aberration of Michael's, but Cold Night, Many Stars, Wrong Screwdriver is a really funny idea. And here, this is an excerpt from lines from The Sea Gazer. After an hour, the room is changed, not so much by light as by the entrance of dismissal of thought. This was for a special project, so we've used Michael's work constantly, and a deep friendship has developed over the years. Visual poetics is our way of thinking about how letter forms, as Kim was saying, letter forms are important and how they dance around the page. I was invited to join up with this group early on, and we just moved to Isla Vista. Richard Castellanet's a strange character. It was invited people to give 1,000 copies of something that was otherwise unpublishable. So I printed this. It was a strange thing. It says LA Open. If you see it on the side, it was a logo from a golf tournament in LA, but I put a piece of paper over half of it. Now, this is how I began to learn printmaking. I didn't have teachers, but I just taught myself by working in the studio. We also taught ourselves by listening to the Firesign Theater and became close friends with David Osman, one of the founders of that group, and did a project with him celebrating one of the anniversaries of this group. If you don't know anything about the Firesign Theater, look them up. I think you'll like it. This deluxe copy of the book had handmade paper used with items they had donated that included tie-dye shirts, which you might think, probably bell-bottom pants, and a pot holder, which is actually a piece of cloth. And this was a visual book with these little strange characters that you find in print shops, and found a way to have these 24 hours, so-called, dealing with this project that they had, these notebooks in creating a record. And so we wound up doing a lot of projects with David Osman out of that group. Another one, Keith Waldrop, I mentioned before, he was my teacher at Brown. He's the one that I read that little excerpt from. And Larson Hefferman, is Ann here today? Hello, Ann. Hi, and thank you so much for giving me all these sectional maps that she pulled off that were being thrown out by the library, and I used them for the cover of this book. It's great to have friends with influence. And so I thank you for helping me with that. There I am with Keith, going over certain things later on. There's that book, Quest for Mount Misery, with a little excerpt we did. And this is the stack of the handmade paper that I was making that I showed earlier. For that book, it took me 4 months to make these papers. The students in my class do this in a week. Isn't that right? A book I did for one of my teachers, Edwin Honig. I did a different cover for each one of these books. I printed his name and the title of the book, Blind, without ink, and then I rubbed over it with brayers, rollers, ink right on top of it, and I put 2 pair of socks on my hands, and I started rubbing around, and every single one of those was a hand ink original painting for a book we sold for $8 in 1983, and I know a lot about how to do this process. And that's what happens in this work. You learn a lot about how to do something very specific. There we have Edwin on the left and on the right, and we came out, we were photographing people with these funny glasses on, and he loved it. Here's a couple more of those covers from Gifts of Light. We started to get a little bit of attention, but what they wanted to do really was to photograph our machines. And we finally said, can't you just photograph our books, please? And so we were fortunate in this article with Santa Barbara Magazine for that to happen. Around the same time, around '84, I created this process I called the Sandragraph. It's too long to explain, but it was one of those processes that I show at a lot of places around the country, and people actually make some sense of it. That was the second Sandragraph there, where I actually made the print on the right, was on this side, which is from the plate over on the other side. And this other one is just not a very good photograph. Sandra didn't want me to use it, but it's masking tape onto wood. And I printed on that. So started making all these strange surfaces to print on. I say, well, why not? I don't know anything about conventional printmaking. I might as well just make it up. So wound up doing a whole portfolio of this that was really pretty good. And I used a quote from Terence McKenna on there, and I got to write about it, and it was really fun, and used this process to back up this work by Sam Hamill, who became a close friend. Sam had been involved with programs here back in the late 60s, early 70s, working with Hugh Kenner and a few others on campus, on the Spectrum magazine on campus, and he won a national award for the best literary magazine in the country in 1972. For Spectrum magazine. And with the $500 grant, he started Copper Canyon Press, which became the top publishing house of poetry in the contemporary poetry in the US. This was this little 8-fold book that I did with Sam, and there he is admiring all of these in the living room, because we printed these over a weekend because he was on a reading tour and the books he was going to sell didn't show up. And I said, Sam, let's go out and make a book. You're the artist, and I can be your printer. So we had a great time with Sam. Sam passed away in April, and we were very sad to see him go. Some people here got to know him fairly well. We had him read at the IHC a couple years back. Bill Ashby was really gracious to help support the visit Sam had to CCS. And I want to read this poem of Sam's. It's part of a larger series. Each word carefully tied to the next. The poem is a net, and no single knot is strong enough to bear the burden alone. Some nets are small, cast for shrimp or herring. Some nets are meant to hold whales. In the ecology of the poem, the fish is not prey, but the surprise catch of the day, a diamond in the coal, a way of awakening to something just beyond what words can say. We've made many books involving translation, including a couple with Sam. This one, 5 meters of poems. We very much wanted to do it because it was a typographically playful book, and in doing something like this, we set the type. And you can imagine for a moment what the type looks like for something like this. Well, you get up closer, you think, wow, this is kind of odd. And this is what the type looks like when you photograph it, and you flip, at that time, the negative. So we thought these looked pretty good. I started doing a series I called Phototypes, which was photographing type. So our activity in the studio led us to think about new ways to look at what we were doing, new perceptions to bridge these technologies. This was a postcard in the series for the American Civil Liberties Union, Group I Support. And so I set the First Amendment here and highlighted a part of it, the freedom of speech. I talked to the students a lot about uncreative writing. There's a lot of writing going on, and as Mr. Wilson would say, all writing is creative, even uncreative writing. But uncreative writing can be using writing that already exists and lives in the world, but finding a new way to position it in terms of authorship. Sandra and I did a project based on living in Isla Vista back in '91, a book installation at the Contemporary Arts Forum. We called it Near Goleta, but Closer. And used our handmade paper. Sandra talked me into making paper with eucalyptus leaves, which had ruined half the shop, but it was really beautiful. We had this book. She photographed me walking out on the low tide. This was our title page. Okay. We had this on display at the Contemporary Arts Forum in Santa Barbara, at the same time that Dane had a show around that time. And we stuffed eucalyptus leaves and balls of tar inside these cases. Isla Vista smells. And this over here was a kiosk that was taken down on campus, and I reassembled it, got it from the guy that built them, and put it up inside of this little gallery. And this was a fun book. This particular image, there was a garage band in town at the time called Gerbil Fury. And Sandra went around on her bicycle and took down all of these posters and brought them back home, and we cut them up and stuck them into this book. And it looked like Russian constructed this work. It was actually Gerbil Fury, all just cut up and put back together again, but not quite the same way. And these are little pieces I was writing about how I like to forage for mushrooms, and I was talking about how I got to do it, I didn't eat them anymore, and so on and so on. But a colorful book. This one had to do with our input and output page, the junk mail on one side and our handmade paper on the other, with these little aphorisms that we like to identify with, such as intuition and attention to attention, and all these smart ideas, and so on. So this book was a lot of fun to do, and we were happy to do it. And I've talked about it several times at the IHC over the last few years in some of their larger gatherings. Another book that used language in slightly different ways, Arp Lines, 8990. I used the work of Jean Arp, Hans Arp, along with my paintings for the covers of these boxes that Sandra made, which I actually like these a lot. And this was a modest book in certain ways when we first made it, and then we elaborated when I finally had the courage to make art about 9 years later, and turned it into an illustrated book. And it has a lot of strange things, including a little bag with all these lines that didn't make it in the book. And here, a plate I used I made from Scotch tape on wood. This one talks about this procedure where I say I stuck together, unstuck, began again, and destroyed, but language broke in my mouth. And that was pretty much how these things have been going. That's the plate that I used. Pages like this were really fun to do, and I wanted to share this with people. The book was not sewn, but it had these elements to it so that you could open up these little pages and get a sense of Arp, but also me. The lines I took from Arp, Jean Arp, Hans Arp, when he wrote in German. But Arp had these wonderful lines in his poems, but his poems are incomprehensible, so I decided to cut them up. And I said that the lines belonged to Arp, but the poems belonged to me, is how I did that. And this last one, well, I'll just keep going. Did other work like this, where I played with language that another notoriously well-known person, James Joyce, had used. Finnegan's Wake. Has anyone ever read Finnegan's Wake here from cover to cover? Ever read it out loud from cover to cover? Yeah, I consider a book that's unreadable, but you can study it, is how I see it. But I applaud you for reading it. It's one of these really difficult ones. On the cover here are the 10 100-letter words in Finnegan's Wake. And did you have a tough time with them? I think absolutely just the opposite now. That was my first impression before I began to study it. And I changed my tune on it quite a bit. But my title, Fun Against Awake, I saw what I thought was going on with Joyce. He was having fun, but he also wanted us to wake up. And that's something that is, you can't quite grasp it on first read. Looking at this language like here, these are difficult, but I asked those who wanted to dismiss it, as I did when I first encountered, I think it's worth going back to, so I'd recommend it. That was one of the 100-letter words. But the process, which I won't really show too much about, was able to work with Granary Books in New York to produce that. Another project that came up later on was called Grasshopper, and I worked with several different versions of the I Ching, the classic Chinese work of writing, and also the work of Philip K. Dick, because it turned out one of our students, Jonathan Cecil, his uncle, wrote a novel using the I Ching. That novel was called The Man in the High Castle, and his uncle was Philip K. Dick, and so that was Uncle Phil. So Jonathan and Paloma Kane, another student, did these monotype prints, really beautiful prints. They came to our studio and did these prints, and we stuck them up on the wall, and then wound up putting them into the book. This book, Grasshoppers, one of our fun books. Because there's a book within a book, we use this kind of theme throughout here. I won't go into it too much, but really enjoyed working with them. We've worked with Joan Tanner, a wonderful person and still a dear friend. Sandra didn't want me to have this image because she thought it didn't show it off too well, but we had a CD in this book. It was a photo CD at the time that was an electronic catalog. It was a lot of unique work. How much do you think it cost us in 1991-92 to make a CD? And how much do you think we paid for one CD? Did anyone want to guess? $100 each? Okay? So a couple of you who've been around the block are saying, yeah, sure, that's what it was. And so luckily those times are behind us. We have other issues. But we had a great time. There's Sandra and Joan working together. It was a very involved process, this book. There's video on it that Dick Dunlap made. This is a view of the unique works in Joan's studio before we put them together. And this is an example of when we had a chance to show all of the books at one time at the Ridley Tree Center in Santa Barbara. Another artist I worked very closely on many projects with over the years and saw just a couple weeks ago in Los Angeles is Ann Hamilton. Worked with her on this exhibit at the Museum of Contemporary Art in LA, the Temporary Contemporary. One night, Ann and I stayed up all night and did a rubbing of this floor, which I still have big examples of for a project one of these days. I went to South Carolina and worked with her on this one called Indigo Blue. There's 40,000 work uniforms, blue uniforms, work clothes piled up there. And a person is erasing a book. It's a blue-covered book of the history of the South. For another project with Ann, I did this printing on wax that she was creating that went to the Hirshhorn Museum. We had some extra wax, and I printed a poem of Michael Hannon's and gave it as a gift for all the people who worked on that project. We were able to work with Kiki Smith. When she came here, Liz Brown at the museum introduced us to Kiki, and we did a project with Kiki. Bill Feeney, who was a grad student at the time, was a really wonderful person to work with. He was close to Kip as well. And there we are, Sandra and myself. If you can't recognize us, it's Bill on the far side, and then that's Kiki. We did a book with Yoko Ono, which was really fun. It's not a great slide, but that's a copper spine. And used this kakishibu paper that has persimmon paper with this pulp cover on it. I've done some public art projects. I don't want to spend too much time on these, but they've been very meaningful to do. This is one kept mentioning. It's at the Central Library in LA. Worked with Judd Fine. very dear friend, and treated this whole installation as if it were a book, which was kind of thing that in another context we had a lot more time, I'd show you more. But here the idea was to show the look of communication over time. Judd wanted to put famous quotes on this step, on the steps here, and I said, I don't know about that. Let's take another look. So I introduced a whole new idea, and he said, well, that makes sense. Let's do that. And so I was happy to put this on there. That's William Blake's writing. This, which is on our last series of steps. The first series was called the earliest prehistoric time. The second one was the period of writing. The third is the period of print. And the fourth one is the period we're in now, which I call the post-literate. And the images from this look a lot like the images from that very first pre-literate time, which are pretty interesting, these symbols. Another project doing public art was in Los Angeles, working with Barry Burkus in Pasadena. I got to put all these things up there that look like books. Actually, there's 329 of these, which was a significant donation to start the library. Is Joel here? But Joel, I want to thank Joel for making this project happen, a public art project I received the commission for, but it would never have happened without Joel. We used handmade paper that was laminated behind glass. This is laid out, these 999 sheets of paper. Too complex of a story to tell here, but we did this paper using abaca, hemp, a lot of the materials that you'd find in the habitats of cranes, which figured largely in this project with Sandra's help and influence. And that's how it looks laminated behind glass on the lobby wall of the Hollywood Community Library, installed in 2006. This public art project went over 6.5 years, which is about 6 years too long. But there I am casting, I think that was on the image sent out, this large sheets of paper, and our paper lad did this duplex kind of casting with one color on one side and one on the other. Got to put these up on the wall with extinct species of birds printed out, a little instruction on how to fold the little origami crane. Had the architect make 3 different sized doors, a little one for the little kids, and the people in the library would not let us open the little doors. It's a liability, you know. But we had the paper was 2 different colors on the sides of the door. The Sea Gazer I read before, so I'll just go through this, but there's Michael Hannon, and this is how the book looked in that edition that we did with some real special processes that some of the students are finding out more about. Sandra working around doing most of the work on the books, as she continues to do. It's a thrill to make these books, and it's special when they happen to be exhibited. There was a show in 2011 at Stanford that Peter Koch and Roberto Trujillo put together. The Art of the Book in California, 5 contemporary presses, and we were among them. There's these big photos of us standing very tall, and we're happy to see those, and so that was pretty cool. And we got to photograph ourselves right next to them, which I always wanted to do. Everybody likes doing this kind of stuff, and we were just yucking it up there. And that was in the book. And then there's Carol Lee, who's here today. Carol Lee was my first book arts student. In many ways, the book arts program was built around her interests. So Carol Lee, who's exited with Sandra, thank you for making this necessary. But it's been great to see her development with Ninja Press over there. And there she is next to her photograph. We've done a lot of projects with Carol Lee over the years. She's been a commencement speaker in CCS. She continues to be one of the top book artists in the country and makes our program look very good with Carol Lee and students like Inga, who's here today, and others, Matt Cohen. People go out into the world and make these books, make our program look pretty good. So I'm happy about that. There's a picture of Carol Lee inside of that book. Jean-Pierre Hébert is here today. Jean-Pierre, I want to thank you for your patience with this book. It's a wonderful project that we were able to make using an idea that Jean-Pierre brought to us for Calvino's Invisible Cities. We call our book Invisible Cities. and have very much enjoyed working with Jean-Pierre and Claire over the years. And it's taken about as long as a public art project takes, I would say. But the process was enjoyable when we were doing it, and we were wondering when it was going to happen again, but life intervenes, and this is a great project to do. This is how the type looks, and often you don't get to see behind it. You don't get to see the editing that goes into these projects. You don't get to see the conversations that happen. All you get to see is the end result. I've done some painting here and there. Was very happy to be represented by Ro Snell. Is Ro here today? Hi, Ro. Thank you so much for being my dealer for my paintings, and for Rick, thank you. And George for being there. I showed this at her gallery and many other works. It was a real pleasure to be able to show paintings at a time when I'm not really trained as a painter either. There's that group show idea raising its head. I'll go through these rather quickly here because I want to get on to one more thing and then wrap this up. But I hope you'll come and take a look at some of these paintings. Got a couple items left here. I want to close. We started doing a form we call the folded broadside. And Thomas Meyer was a long-term companion with Jonathan Williams. Showed his work earlier with the Jargon Society, but we did projects with Jonathan. And Tom taught himself to read Chinese using FileMaker Pro software. Think about that. And Tom is one of these really serious, untrained scholars who will do just about anything. And so his translations from the Chinese are among some of the most lyrical that I've read. He's translated the I Ching, which I based that whole Grasshopper project around his translation. This is from his Tao Te Ching. I made this a few years ago for a big celebration of this Vandercook book, which celebrates the press, the Vandercook that we all use. It's been around for 100 years. And this is how the folded broadside, Important Things, reads. Best to be like water, always useful, never difficult, settling in low-lying places. Most people consider foul, something it shares with the Tao, the way or the path. Looking for some place to live, the important thing is situation. In matters of the heart, the important thing is depth. As for relationships, the important thing is kindness. With words, the important thing is sincerity. Being in charge, the important thing is fairness. Undertaking anything, the important thing is ability. Making any move, the important thing is timing. Where there's a lack of aggression, there's a lack of ill wills. It is hard to handle a cup filled to the brim, and better to know when to stop pouring. No matter how much you sharpen the blade, it will still go dull. Impossible to protect a house packed full of precious stuff. Money and success bring their own failure. Knowing when the thing is done is knowing the Tao. To rescue and contain, but not shoo away the soul. Finally, firmly grasp its unity. Focus upon the breath. Soften it like a child who cannot speak yet. Wash away all ideas to see flawlessly, love the people, and heal the country. This is a picture of our house in 2011, spiffed up a bit. Hope some of you have a chance to see it, but just don't drop in. We have a very big fence. No vicious dog, but a couple of cats roaming around. And this is a picture of it just recently. It's changed since we've been there. We've spent our time mostly with the work that we do, but we feel so fortunate to be able to do it. I wanted to throw out all kinds of expressions during this talk, things like the comments from William Gibson, that the future is already here. It's just not very evenly distributed. And other remarks like that I throw into the students all the time, and they look at me like, oh, do we have to do this again? And my favorite ones come from this tried and tested out patterns of behavior that we have. There's the press, they're entering the press. There's Sandra and I are talking, but behind us is one of Eric Beltz's drawings, it's really kind of appropriate. I thought, I didn't take it personally, but I like the good luck part. They say that when you work with your spouse, it's like being married twice as long. And I think I have to say it feels that way. But we can't complain. So thanks a lot. Appreciate it. Thank you, Kip. Thank you. Great. Thank you. I'd love some questions. Is that okay? I'm sorry I went on so long, but of course, as we said earlier, if it wasn't for Kelly and the people I hung out with, I would have been a lot quieter. So please, I just take them? Yes, please. Do you want to let everybody know? Stand up. Can you do that? Okay. Or does this mic work? Does that work? Does that work?
Advocates for like more consumption of poetry from mass society, because like I feel like after a certain point, like innovation in art isn't necessarily conducive to more people.
Is that a question?
Yeah, I'm just curious. Like, how do you feel like this advocates for more consumption?
I'm not an advocate. Let me put it that way. I'm a maker of things. Advocates I left behind at Hastings College because advocates are always on the side. My way of making this work, and I don't mean this in any kind of assertive way, other than to say that my interests were more in the attention to the matter at hand. If someone got something out of it, great. But so many people persuasion is one of the worst aspects of our contemporary culture. It's everywhere. Advertising, sell something. That's not what we're trying to do. If people want, we used to say, there's a huge difference between selling something and having someone buy it from you. I like that category of having someone buy it from you. Selling it is work. It's about putting on a different face, different persona. There's nothing wrong with this for the major part of the society, I'm sure, because so many people do it. But I decided to take another path, another way. So if people can get something out of this work, I hope it's around long enough, and I hope the culture is here long enough for someone to get something out of it. It's a very good question. These small presses, what can they contribute? Why aren't they being larger? Why aren't they larger? Well, you start where you are. As Sue Grafton said, don't think. Start right in the middle of it. And don't be intimidated by the enormity of what you undertake. I like that. I liked it then, I like it now. It's sometimes hard not to be intimidated, but we try. Another question here? Thank you for your question.
Can you tell us about the name Turkey Press?
Yes, Jeremy. I usually say that one because I know it will come from the audience. Benjamin Franklin wanted the turkey to be the national bird. He thought the eagle lived by sharping and robbing. But the turkey was an otherwise respectable bird. And he wanted the turkey to be the national bird. Now, he was not talking about the domestic turkey. The writer Robert Pinsky, the poet Pinsky, I was doing a project with him at Brown with Edmunds Press before he had any book out. And I designed a book for him, and Penske was, he was very excited about it. And he took me aside, because I told him I was going to call the press Turkey Press. He took me aside, he says, when a play flops on Broadway, they call it a turkey. And I said, really? I think I'll call it Turkey Press anyway, but thank you. And so I was happy to call it Turkey Press. I didn't think I'd keep the name for very long. I thought I'd go do something respectable and get into some other field, but luckily I stayed doing it. Very good. Thanks. Pass that to someone else for other questions. Mike? Or anyone? One at a time.
First one is, what do you want to do next? And can you talk about the difference between Turkey Press and Edition Reese?
I wish I could. What I want to do next is I want to continue making books. I'd like to play golf with Bill Ashby. I'd like to take walks. I'd like to play guitar with Kip, with Dave, people I know, my brother-in-law. I'd like to continue doing whatever I feel like doing. I remember I used to tell that to Sandra, and she was so annoyed with me. I said, my goal is to do whatever I want, whenever I want to do it, in any way I want. And she'd say, oh, come on now, you can't say things like that. It's kind of the same thing. I said, well, I'm being honest. I may not be accurate, I may not be able to do it, but that's what and it's the same thing here. I've got a book project I've been working on many years, and call it the Book of Change. And I'm trying to get that one, squeeze that out. I can't do it in the last couple of years, so that was part of my rationale for stepping down from this post. As our Executive Vice Chancellor has described retirement, it's like a grant into doing something else. Think about that. A grant, go do something. And I think that's a pretty good idea. So I thought I might as well do this, especially when I can move around and be pretty active. So that's the plan. And Edition Reese and Turkey Press, one is more of, we started doing projects with artists. I could not give them away the way that I used to with Turkey Press. I give books away. The first year I had subscribers for $10. They got everything I did. And the second year I raised the price. I went to $15. And I could not give away work like Ann Hamilton or these other people I worked with, or Wiley. And I said, I've got to create a new imprint. But what happened was, and she's not in the room, but Sandra started doing the same thing with Edition Reese that she did with Turkey Press. So I thought, oh, we should not have even changed the name. But we did it for a real particular reason. Because there were people that used to collect our work. And they had copies, whole editions. And we went from a book that cost $7 to one that cost $1,000. I thought, I can't expect these people to keep their collections up. So I made a slight alteration so they could buy it if they wanted or not. And didn't have to keep the collection up. So that's the short answer. But it was more out of consideration for these people because we figured that we would make the same amount of money if we made 10 copies and priced it high, or made 100 copies and 200 copies and priced it low. Kind of balanced out. Actually, because of stamina, we could not make too many, so we decided to make the smaller numbers. And also, that's the only way we could continue because it was becoming increasingly clear to us that we weren't just making books of poetry, that we were doing something that we dared not say in the beginning. We were making art, and we didn't know it.
We have a question right here.
Question?
Well, you mentioned working with Terence McKenna as well as quoting him in your book, and I noticed that two of the titles you had really stood out as if they were like ripped directly from his lectures, with The Unspeakable and The Archaic Revival. So I just wanted to know how the ideas he presented in his life affected or influenced your work.
It's a good question. I got to be friends with Terence through Roy Tuckman's program, KTFK, and he came, for a long time I passed tapes around campus. Some people here probably got them, particularly working with Roman Brodziak in Arts and Lectures to try to bring Terence here. And they finally said they didn't feel comfortable bringing, because he'd been here several times earlier, but they didn't feel comfortable bringing him back because of his drug message. So I told this news to Terence, trying to work it out. He said, look, I don't want to come there to give a talk. I want to come to meet you. So he came and met with Sandra and I and had lunch with us, and we got to be pretty close friends. And we started working on his time wave zero project, and I was going to make these prophetic maps of this time wave based on the I Ching. It's a long story, but we got to be pretty close, and he wound up right around that time being invited to give an invitational workshop at Esalen, where he invited his friends. So he called me up and asked me to come. So I took off a week from teaching at the College of Creative Studies and went to Esalen for a week with him. Tom Robbins is one of the people there. I got to know him pretty well. And so it was a real good time with Terrence, real fertile. And so when I had the show of paintings at Rose Gallery later, one of the paintings was called Archaic Revival because Terrence's thinking was very much in my mind at the time. And we also shared an interest in the writing of Guy Davenport, which is where he got a lot of that information about the Archaic Revival, from the writer Guy Davenport. So I read Davenport and I talked to Terrence about that when he first. And I talked to him about McLuhan. He started using McLuhan and talked about Finnegan's Wake, so that Writing the Wave tape that he did came out of those conversations that I presented to him at Esalen. That's kind of a long story, but we got to be pretty close friends.
I was wondering how you feel about Twitter and Facebook and where text appears, and if you find poetry in these kinds of short messages that are on social media, and if you feel like you could be inspired by them.
The question is, how do I feel about Twitter and other social media as far as the text and its poetic possibilities? I don't look at those. I hear about them in the way that I hear about poems written in Italy or poems that might be written in South America, that kind of thing. And so when I find out more about it, I would probably be aware of it. But I have a passive relation with that kind of social media because I don't participate in it. And so I really don't know. I don't, and it isn't that I don't care about it, but it's pretty close to that. But I think it is ripe for poetic opportunity. The problem is it's embedded in these other means that, for me, ultimately chafe away at it and would probably make it a little bit less authentic for some people.
I'm just going to, for a minute, we can continue questions, but there are some students that need to leave it's for the class. But if some people have a few more questions, and please, if you're leaving, do it quietly. But we also, you're welcome to come up after. But shall we give them a round of applause?
Thank you.